The first push was more a nudge, really. A prod with a biker's heavy boot that sent Viktor Petrov's carefully arranged carrots spilling across the muddy cobblestones of the Kirovgrad market. A crude, sneering laugh followed, amplified by the roar of engines nearby, and a cold dread, sharper than the morning chill, pricked at Viktor's skin. The men surrounding him, young and full of a casual cruelty, saw only a fat farmer, an easy mark. They couldn't know, not in their wildest dreams, that this man, stooping slowly to gather his scattered harvest, this humble figure they were about to humiliate, was in fact a retired Delta Force commander. Another shove, harder this time, came with a gruff demand to pick up your trash, pig. Viktor's breath hitched, a familiar tightness seizing his chest, a ghost of an old ache. He saw the cruel glint in the biker's eye, a hunger for power, a desire to break something simple and good. For a fleeting instant, a different kind of fire, long banked, flickered within him, a distant memory of a younger self. Swift and lethal, meeting such insolence with devastating precision, but that Viktor belonged to another lifetime, another world. Now, there was only the dull throb of resignation, the crushing weight of years and profound losses pressing him down, a silent burden he carried alone. He sank to his knees, a soft groan escaping his lips as they protested. The damp chill of the ground seeped through his worn trousers, but he hardly noticed. His fingers, gnarled and calloused from decades of tilling the unforgiving soil, trembled slightly as he began the quiet, laborious task of gathering each scattered carrot, each one a testament to weeks of patient, unseen work. The laughter continued, punctuated by snide remarks about his size, about the agonizing slowness of his movements. A searing flush of shame, a sensation he hadn't known in decades, not since he was a small boy. Too weak to stand against the relentless torment of bullies crept up his neck. The echo of that old powerlessness, that deep vulnerability, gnawed at him, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. All he truly longed for was to disappear, to simply vanish from their mocking gaze, to return to his small farm in peace. Far from the harsh judgments of a world that now saw nothing but his visible weaknesses, the market buzzed on, a vibrant tapestry of life that seemed to ignore the small, crumpled figure on the ground. Vendors who, just moments before, had been chattering jovially, now averted their eyes, their faces etched with a practiced indifference. He understood. No one wanted trouble, and a confrontation with these bikers, who often loitered near the market's edge, meant trouble. His spilled carrots, his humiliation, were just another brief disturbance in their day, quickly forgotten in the clamor of commerce. He felt an isolation so profound it was almost physical, as if a thick, invisible wall had sprung up around him, separating him from the bustling world. Even old Fyodor, who sold smoked fish beside him for years and usually offered a gruff greeting, simply busied himself with rearranging his display, his back turned, a silent testament to the world's abandonment. Later that week, back on his small, windswept farm on the outskirts of Kirovgrad, the echoes of the market incident still clung to him like the persistent damp of the early autumn air. The chickens pecked at the dry earth, oblivious, in the old farmhouse, once filled with the laughter of his late wife, Anya, and the boisterous energy of their son Andrei, now held a silence that was a constant, knowing presence. He ran his hand over the worn wooden table where they used to share meals, feeling the smooth indentations of forgotten fingers. Andrei had been gone for years, lost to a war in a distant land he'd barely understood, and Anya, a year after that, her heart, giving out under the weight of a grief too immense to bear. Every chore, every lonely meal, every creak of the old house was a fresh reminder of the voids in his life. Vast and aching, the shame from the market lingered, not just the public humiliation, but the internal capitulation. He, Viktor who had faced down horrors no civilian could ever imagine, who had commanded respect and instilled fear in the hearts of hardened men, had simply cowered. The memory curdled in his stomach. He saw himself through the biker's eyes, a fat, slow man, ripe for ridicule. And perhaps a tiny, insidious voice whispered, they weren't entirely wrong. He was slower, heavier, his body no longer the finely tuned instrument of his youth. His muscles ached constantly, his breath came harder, and the fire that had once burned so fiercely within him had dwindled to embers, barely flickering against the cold wind of his solitude. One afternoon, as he struggled to hoist a heavy sack of potatoes onto his rickety cart, his back seizing with a sharp pain, a small shadow fell over him. It was Marina, a young woman who ran the small bakery in the village, known for her quiet demeanor and eyes that held an ancient kindness. She didn't offer pity or words of sympathy. Instead, without a sound, she simply reached out, her small hands surprisingly strong, and helped him lift the sack, guiding it gently into place. Her touch was fleeting, her gaze brief and unassuming, but in that silent gesture, a crack appeared in the thick wall of Victor's isolation. A warmth, small but persistent, began to spread through his chest. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time, the faint, unexpected glow of human kindness. A few days later, a faded flyer tacked to the bulletin board outside Marina's bakery caught Victor's eye. It announced an open call for security personnel at the new, privately owned industrial park being built just outside Kirovgrad. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and the work, the flyer claimed, would be mostly supervisory. He scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. Security. Him, the man who had crumbled before a few unruly youths at the market. The irony was bitter, and he almost walked away, dismissive. This isn't for you, old man, a voice inside him whispered, the same voice that echoed the biker's taunts. You're done with that life. Yet, something held him. Perhaps it was Marina's quiet kindness, a tiny seed of belief planted in the barren soil of his despair. Perhaps it was the gnawing emptiness of his days, the longing for a purpose beyond the unending cycle of planting and harvesting. He thought of Anya, who had always believed in his quiet strength, and Andrei, whose youthful idealism had so often mirrored his own fierce sense of duty. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was back in a dusty, sun-baked landscape. The roar of gunfire in his ears, the sharp, almost intoxicating clarity of purpose that had once defined him. His hand twitched, remembering the solid weight of a rifle, the precise movements, the absolute certainty of his skills. The memory was a double-edged sword, a reminder of who he once was, and a painful contrast to who he had become. The first step into the gleaming, impersonal lobby of the security firm was excruciating. His worn farm boots felt heavy and out of place on the polished floor, and he suddenly felt every extra pound, every creak in his joints. The young woman at the desk, with her crisp uniform and polite, distant smile, asked for his resume. Resume. He hadn't had one in decades. He stammered, explained his past in the military, the special forces. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes, he noticed, held a subtle flicker of skepticism, a silent judgment that he was just another old man trying to relive some imagined glory. She sees a broken toy, Victor, the voice hissed. Useless, he half expected to be dismissed immediately, but instead, he was led to a small, windowless office where a thin, stern-faced man named Colonel Volkov sat behind a metal desk. Volkov, a veteran himself, albeit from a different branch, listened impassively as Victor recounted his service, his voice gaining a hesitant confidence as he spoke of tactics and leadership, of the quiet dedication required in the shadows. He omitted the Delta Force designation. Some things were best left unsaid. Volkov's gaze was unsettlingly direct, probing, as if trying to peel back the layers of the heavy, silent man before him. Victor felt exposed, vulnerable, like a raw wound laid bare. He half expected to hear the usual platitudes, the polite dismissal, but then Volkov leaned forward, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "We need men who understand more than just patrols, Petrov," he said, his voice low. "We need men who understand resolve." A faint, almost imperceptible warmth spread through Victor's chest at the word, a tiny ember of hope beginning to glow. The first few weeks at the industrial park were a revelation. The familiar routine, the structured environment, the quiet camaraderie with a few of the older, more seasoned guards, it was a balm to his wounded spirit. He patrolled the vast, echoing warehouses, his steps slower but no less deliberate, his eyes missing nothing. The aches in his body seemed less pronounced, overshadowed by a rediscovered sense of purpose. Colonel Volkov, true to his word, had given him responsibilities that tapped into his deeper understanding of security, tasking him with training a small group of younger, eager recruits in observation and perimeter defense. He found himself speaking with authority again, his voice firm, the words flowing with a clarity he hadn't realized he still possessed. The warmth that Marina's kindness had ignited now flickered brighter, threatening to become a small, steady flame. He began to dream again, small, tentative dreams of stability, of finally finding a quiet peace in this new, unexpected chapter. Then came the night the power grid failed. It was a cold, blustery evening, rain lashing against the corrugated metal roofs, and suddenly, the vast industrial park was plunged into absolute darkness. The emergency generators, for reasons unknown, spluttered and died. Chaos, swift and unsettling, began to ripple through the complex. Victor, supervising a night shift, moved instinctively, his training kicking in. He issued commands, his voice cutting through the rising panic, directing guards to key checkpoints, trying to establish a temporary perimeter. But the younger recruits, disoriented by the sudden blackness and the unexpected vulnerability, hesitated, fumbled. A new, icy dread began to coil in Victor's stomach, a familiar echo of a past failure. A mission gone wrong because of a breakdown in communication, a moment of weakness. Hours later, as the dawn light reluctantly broke through the heavy clouds, illuminating the sprawling industrial park in a harsh, unforgiving gray, the extent of the failure became painfully clear. A section of the perimeter fence, left unmonitored by the panicked recruits, had been breached. Though nothing appeared to be stolen, the security breach was undeniable, a glaring hole in the very fabric of the new system Victor had been helping to build. Colonel Volkov's face, when he arrived, was grim, his eyes cold and distant. He listened to Victor's explanation, his expression unreadable, and then, with a quiet finality, he said the words that sliced through Victor like a razor. "This is unacceptable, Petrov. We trusted you." The warmth, the small, tender flame of hope that had begun to grow within Victor, was extinguished in an instant. He felt the familiar weight of shame, heavier now than ever, crushing him. It wasn't just the job, or the disappointment from Volkov. It was the sickening realization that he had failed himself. He had seen a path, a way back to something resembling purpose, and he had stumbled. The old voices returned, louder and more insistent than before. "Useless, broken, you can't escape it." He trudged back to his desolate farm, the rhythmic squeak of his worn boots on the muddy track mimicking the relentless torment in his mind. The vast empty silence of his farmhouse now seemed to mock him, a physical manifestation of his utter defeat. He collapsed onto his old wooden chair, staring at the scarred table, and for the first time in years, the crushing weight of everything Anya Andre, the market, and now this made him want to simply give up, to let the silence consume him entirely. He closed his eyes, and a single, unbidden tear, hot and heavy, traced a lonely path down his weathered cheek. For 3 days, Victor barely left his farmhouse, consumed by a bleak despair that threatened to swallow him whole. The chickens went unfed, the small garden unwatered, the world outside his 4 walls, a blurry, indifferent canvas. He moved through his days in a fog, the memory of Volkov's cold eyes, the sting of the words, a constant, low thrum beneath his skin. He had felt this abyss before, in the immediate aftermath of Anya's death, and after the telegram that shattered his world with news of Andrei. It was the deepest darkness, the place where even the will to breathe seemed too great a burden. This is it, he thought, the thought a comfort in its finality. This is where you finally break. But on the fourth morning, a small, insistent scratching at his door pulled him from the edge. It was Marina, her face etched with a quiet concern, holding a basket covered with a linen cloth. She didn't speak, just offered the basket, her eyes gentle. Inside, nestled among freshly baked bread and a small jar of berry jam, was a single, perfect, vibrant red rose, still dewy from the morning. It was a silent offering, a gesture of unwavering kindness that cut through the fog of his despair like a ray of sunlight. The rose was from her own garden, a small, private sanctuary behind her bakery, and its simple beauty, its resilient life, spoke volumes that no words could. He looked at the rose, then at Marina, her gaze steady, unwavering. A fragile, almost imperceptible shift occurred within him. This wasn't pity. This was quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of the humanity that still existed within him. Despite his failures, despite his grief, he thought of the young recruits at the industrial park, their fear in the dark, their inexperience. They had fumbled, yes, but they were still raw, still learning. His failure wasn't just his own. It was a failure to guide them, to truly lead them through their panic. The responsibility, he realized with a jolt, was not just about preventing breaches, but about forging resolve in others, about imparting the very strength Volkov had spoken of. He had let his own wounds blind him to their need. That afternoon, he returned to the market. The bikers were there again, lounging near the entrance, their presence a familiar shadow. Victor walked past them, his head held a fraction of an inch higher than before, his gaze steady, meeting theirs for the first time without flinching. He didn't engage, didn't provoke. He simply walked with a quiet dignity, not an act of bravado, but an assertion of his own inner space, a reclamation of his own worth. The taunts still came, low and mocking, but this time they felt hollow, distant, unable to penetrate the newfound resolve that had begun to solidify within him. He was no longer just the fat farmer from the market. He was Viktor Petrov, a man who had fallen, yes, but who was slowly, deliberately, beginning to stand again. For 3 days, Victor barely left his farmhouse, consumed by a bleak despair that threatened to swallow him whole. The chickens went unfed, the small garden unwatered, the world outside his 4 walls, a blurry, indifferent canvas. He moved through his days in a fog, the memory of Volkov's cold eyes, the sting of the words, a constant, low thrum beneath his skin. He had felt this abyss before, in the immediate aftermath of Anya's death, and after the telegram that shattered his world with news of Andrei. It was the deepest darkness, the place where even the will to breathe seemed too great a burden. This is it, he thought, the thought a comfort in its finality. This is where you finally break. But on the 4th morning, a small, insistent scratching at his door pulled him from the edge. It was Marina, her face etched with a quiet concern, holding a basket covered with a linen cloth. She didn't speak, just offered the basket, her eyes gentle. Inside, nestled among freshly baked bread and a small jar of berry jam, was a single, perfect, vibrant red rose, still dewy from the morning. It was a silent offering, a gesture of unwavering kindness that cut through the fog of his despair like a ray of sunlight. The rose was from her own garden, a small, private sanctuary behind her bakery, and its simple beauty, its resilient life, spoke volumes that no words could. He looked at the rose, then at Marina, her gaze steady, unwavering. A fragile, almost imperceptible shift occurred within him. This wasn't pity. This was quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of the humanity that still existed within him. Despite his failures, despite his grief, he thought of the young recruits at the industrial park, their fear in the dark, their inexperience. They had fumbled, yes, but they were still raw, still learning. His failure wasn't just his own. It was a failure to guide them, to truly lead them through their panic. The responsibility, he realized with a jolt, was not just about preventing breaches, but about forging resolve in others, about imparting the very strength Volkov had spoken of. He had let his own wounds blind him to their need. That afternoon, he returned to the market. The bikers were there again, lounging near the entrance, their presence a familiar shadow. Victor walked past them, his head held a fraction of an inch higher than before, his gaze steady, meeting theirs for the first time without flinching. He didn't engage, didn't provoke. He simply walked with a quiet dignity, not an act of bravado, but an assertion of his own inner space, a reclamation of his own worth. The taunts still came, low and mocking, but this time they felt hollow, distant, unable to penetrate the newfound resolve that had begun to solidify within him. He was no longer just the fat farmer from the market. He was Viktor Petrov, a man who had fallen, yes, but who was slowly, deliberately, beginning to stand again. The weeks that followed blurred into a quiet rhythm of purpose. Victor returned to the industrial park, not seeking reinstatement, but offering his time, his knowledge. He spent hours with the young recruits, not in formal training sessions, but in quiet conversations during their breaks, sharing anecdotes from his past, not of combat, but of the calm required under pressure, the importance of anticipation, the hidden strength found in unity. He spoke of his own mistakes, his own moments of doubt, allowing his vulnerability to become a bridge rather than a barrier. He taught them to see with more than just their eyes, to listen to the subtle whispers of their surroundings, to trust their instincts. Volkov watched him, silent at first, then with a slowly dawning respect. The breach at the fence, once a mark of failure, became a profound lesson, a crucible from which true leadership emerged. Victor's farm, too, began to breathe again. Marina often visited, sometimes with a fresh pastry, sometimes just to sit on the porch swing, sharing the comfortable silence. She never pried, never offered unasked for advice, but her presence was a steadying force. He found himself planting new seeds, not just for his vegetables, but for a future he hadn't dared to imagine. He invited the younger recruits to his farm, teaching them about the soil, about patience, about the quiet satisfaction of nurturing life. They saw not a retired commander, but a wise, gentle man who had known hardship and found resilience. The extra weight he carried on his frame no longer felt like a burden, but a testament to a life lived, a history etched onto his very being. One crisp autumn morning, months later, Victor was at the Kirovgrad market, setting out his late season cabbage. The air was colder, the lights softer, and the familiar clamor felt different, no longer threatening. Then he saw them, the same bikers, lounging by the entrance, their leather jackets still glinting. His heart gave a familiar flutter, a ghost of old fear, but this time it was quickly quelled. He met their gaze, not defiantly, but with a quiet, inner peace. The lead biker, the one who had prodded him, hesitated, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology, or a gesture of friendship, but it was an acknowledgement. The mockery was gone, replaced by something akin to grudging respect. Victor smiled, a genuine, gentle smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. He was still the farmer, still the man who missed his wife and son, still carried the scars of 1,000 battles, seen and unseen. But he was also more. He had found his resolve, not in a uniform or a command, but in the quiet strength of his spirit, in the dignity of hard work, and in the profound, often unexpected, kindness of others. He stood a little straighter, his shoulders broader, not just with the weight of his years, but with the quiet, triumphant weight of a life finally lived on his own terms. The market buzzed around him, a symphony of sounds, and for the first time in a very long time, Viktor Petrov felt truly at peace, his journey of quiet redemption finally complete.